Dear audience, dear Chairman, as you may have heard, I'm a student of philosophy. Yes, another one, not the first. So I'm not very familiar with the psychologist terminology, but I'll try my best. However, as you may know, it is often objected to philosophers that they have a certain tendency to express themselves in quite general terms. However, I wouldn't yet consider myself to be a philosopher. Nevertheless, I'm sorry to say that my speech is going to confirm this prejudice. Voilà. But then also another circumstance should be taken into consideration. Professor Hamburger was invited by quite on short notice. Hence, I knew my assigned referent and his speech in an even shorter period. Be it as it may, I will try to make the best of it. In this reply to the talk given by Professor Hamburger, I would like to proceed in two main steps. In the first section, I'm going to give a short summary in my own words of Professor Hamburger's speech. This section will contain also some questions which have occurred during reading the text. It's my scientific contribution, or rather my attempt to do so. But my second part is dedicated to a few reflections from a 22-year-old as myself, who is supposed to be part of a particularly wild young generation. As long as we trust the image given by the media, it will be a one-sided but intuitively sincere consideration. I repeat, it will be one-sided, but with the deliberate aim to launch intergenerational discourse. That's my role as I see it, and how I can contribute to the success of this event. As far as I have understood Professor Hamburger's talk, the main thesis is a psychological one. Namely, the process of learning are basically temporal or rhythmic and structured as proto-narrative envelopes. These processes depend on the personal degree of affect attunement in early childhood and the level of socialization. Abnormal violence is based on underdevelopment of each of these two factors. But what are proto-narrative envelopes? As far as I understand it, they are some sort of pre-linguistic structure of interaction which allows language to be developed and learned in a form of a curve of expectation. It's within the structure of these basically temporal or even rhythmic now moments that the baby quite quickly learns to distinguish his caretakers from others. This is the first aim or instinct in child's development, the temporal affect attunement or affect matching to its caretaker. It's just realized by that rhythmic element. I just realized that rhythmic element is even in the word attunement, as the tune says. This aspect helps the child to have a first grasp of his own identity. It's an independent act of mirroring between the child and his caretaker. It's synchronization, as you said. As soon as this first safe port for the child, meaning the caretaker, is known or internalized, the transition to the second step consists in getting in touch with its surroundings, social or symbolic as well as natural surroundings. This is the moment when the child learns understanding the more complex world by making mistakes or experiencing conflicts. It's here where the child's level of empathy is developed, where it learns to mentalize, meaning the metacognitive capacity of nachfühlen, as Max Scheler put it. I would consider this moment I call socialization, which is a permanent process even in adult age, as a habit of continuous orientation in the social context. So far, my summary. I'm going to take on elements of this summary later on. What about my questions? One slight difference or distinction on a moreover general level, however, which may seem pedantic but seems important to me. Everyone would agree when I'm saying that aggression has an impulsive aspect, but at the same time it consists principally in a lack of inhibition. In this respect, I'm not quite sure about the relation between these two aspects. Are they motivationally the same? With reference to violence, I wonder whether impulsiveness is the same as lack of self-control. Obviously, in the end, the effect is the same. However, using Husserl's, meaning the phenomenologist, the early Austrian phenomenologist in the 19th and 20th century, in using his phenomenological terminology, it's a matter of two different acts. We may imagine two men who are perfectly identical, in particular in respect of their level of aggressiveness or their impulsive tendency to apply violence. It's kind of, we make ein Gedankenspiel, as you say in philosophy. Well, these two men have the same level of aggressiveness, and we may as well agree to say that impulsiveness is something spontaneous, something uncontrolled. Now, let's introduce a slight difference. One of these two men has a high degree of inhibiting his impulsiveness. He has himself under control, despite his first feeling aggressiveness, while the other hasn't himself under control. Consequently, we wouldn't, at least as far as I'm concerned, talk about the same man any longer because we would perceive their respective behavior differently. Although the impulsiveness as well as the aggressiveness is still exactly the same, we wouldn't treat them in the same manner. Shouldn't discussion about violence rather tend to discuss the structure of inhibition or self-control towards violence? I know that I'm about to expand the discussion into terms of internalism, externalism, but it seems to me as if this question is of a practical importance for both therapy and research. But there remains an open question, and I admit that my point isn't developed completely. Maybe we have even talked about violence in this manner all along yesterday and this morning, and I simply didn't get it. I would like to move on to my second point. Maybe here I may contribute more. Actually, this point should be a direct application of the theory discussed by Professor Hamburger's speech, or by Professor Hamburger. I'm going to mentalize now. Consider it as a first step in a psychoanalytical session. I'm trying to explain my point of view which raises a conflict in myself. Maybe it's about affect attunement on a higher and more sophisticated level of identity finding. I'll try to paraphrase my intuitive point of view about violence and its role or importance for my generation. Even though it's dangerous to personalize a public or presentation, I'm confident that neither you, nor the audience, nor myself will take it personal. I'm male. I've slightly passed the critical age of 20 years. I have a different cultural background because my mother's originally from former Yugoslavia. I've visited my grandparents in Bosnia several times during wartime. In spare time, I do martial art. I would describe myself as rather emotive and impulsive, yet self-controlled. I don't know with which probability I should be criminal in regard of these attributes. Probably statistics wouldn't be very favorable to me, but statistics should be undiscriminating. Are they really? The discussion about youth violence is basically charged with anxiety. As we know, in a state of fear or anxiety, perception becomes particularly susceptible and selective. We literally hear the walls creaking. In my opinion, that's what is happening in the discussion about youth violence. It's a question of the way we consider it. People have become particularly sensitive to newspapers' headings about violence. Media diffuse information depending on the demand, or they even exploit a latent anxiety. We also know that in case of impression of latent danger mixed with general anxiety. We see, well, I repeat the phrase, the whole sentence. We also know that in case of impression of latent danger mixed with a general anxiety, right? Anxiety. We seem to be in need of simplification and generalization. And that's the moment when a whole group is concerned, when we begin to talk about a youth violence in general terms. But is it my generation, or is my generation the reason of this phenomena, or is it society? I'm quite unsure about the origins of this anxiety, this word. But the only thing I can say is that the form has a form of a question. Maybe it's not the generation who has changed so radically, but rather the point of view. Do I play down a factual situation? Let me consider another aspect. I'm quite young. Beneath many advantages, the main problem consists, in this discussion, in my lacking a proper emotional memory of events before the time of my first memory. Here I'm concerned with a problem which is going to be treated by Professor Welzer later on. It's already not easy to reply to general objections about youth violence raised by older people than me, but it's practically impossible when I face so-called nostalgic remarks as, in former times, everything was different or better. I'm rather unsure about the sources of this nostalgia. I know, introspectively, that the facing such reaction raises an identity conflict within myself, a conflict in respect of my belonging to the youth, to the generation. Often such nostalgic, as I call it, attitudes seem to be implicit. For instance, when people are now suddenly shocked about actual violence. Unfortunately, as I said, I haven't got a proper memory of these former times, and I have no choice but to refer to that emotional part of collective memory that Professor Welzer called photo album. This, however, implicates my generation's being a particularly violent one. My point is that nostalgic remarks as such, with a negative implication for the younger generation's collective self-image, are basically counterproductive to intergenerational dialogue and may even enforce the development question. It is the case of youth violence. I say it may, but at least it doesn't help to improve the phenomena of youth violence. They may enforce this development because, with reference to an emotional collective memory, they put the individual, the youngster, in a principled dead end. Even if the young individual would accept this memory with its nostalgic, distorted elements, he couldn't do so without paying the price of a more or less changed self-estimation and identity. So, what remains? The solution may be quite simple and picks up the first part of my reply. What I opt for, and here I retake the words of Professor Spillmann, in a slightly modified context, what I opt for is a shift of emphasis. Doesn't work now. A shift of emphasis. A shift from anxiety, again, okay. I opt for a shift of emphasis. A shift from anxiety. That's nice. From anxiety to more self-confidence. From anxiety to trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Darian Heim, for your comments. And I think we have, of course, we are running late as usual in these meetings. And we have to limit ourselves to maybe 5 minutes discussing the dialogue between the two of you. And then I think I would also like to have 5 minutes to open the floor for questions of the audience to the main presentation. And I think I would like to invite you to comment on the comment.
Yes, first of all, many thanks. It is all about time, you know. You have read my presentation only 2 or 3 days ago, because all of this was in a hurry. And so I really admire you to having formulated your thoughts so quickly. It's all about time. You remember I spoke about the necessity for the analyst to react quite quickly sometimes, Peter Fonagy with his violent patience. So it's a form of violence to have to comment in such a forum without any preparation time, which I did to you, sorry. So I was touched by your point, you repeatedly alluded point of the being part of an accused generation. You said, my generation, I feel accused as a part of this generation as being a violent generation. I am male, I am 22, and so on, everything, migration background, and so on. I think as an analyst, I would say this is a very valuable and very important way to understand situations is to reflect your own feelings. So this is what we do in our work. When I say I feel like being the accused person in this consulting room now, and I try to work with these feelings. We call this countertransference, and I think you reacted in your personality, and I find it very interesting that you opened your reaction to us, so we can discuss it with you. The second point was on mentalizing, and what came into my mind when you discussed on this being part of the accused generation, I think we face in this time also a very rapidly evolving society. So this has the result that any generation is something like on the surpassing road. In our generation, we feel surpassed by the technological and so on abilities of the younger generations. For example, if I look at MTV, music clips, I can't follow. For me, they are too fast, simply. My children think I'm something like an old walrus or something who cannot follow normal things because they are attuned to this quick temporality. And now we are here practically 3 generations. I think it's very interesting that this quick evolution of technology, of society, of interactional forms also prevent what is guaranteed in more traditional societies, that the mentalizing rituals in the early childhood resemble their second edition in adolescence. So a normal adolescence in a hierarchical, traditional society is something like a second childhood. If you go to school, if you go to military, you feel like a child, and you have a father, and the father has the command, and everything is clear. But I think we are facing now a situation where these structures dissolve. And maybe 40 years ago, it wouldn't be possible that 2 of us were openly discussing on one floor. I would speak and you would put down your notes. So it's a very new, culturally and historically new situation. And I think that maybe as a part of discussion on violence, that we are losing this kind of security that early structures are practically repeated in adolescence. Now adolescence is much more like Christoph Columbus. You are going new ways, necessarily. I think I will close here. This is what came to my mind. Thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you. I'd like to invite you to comment on the dialogue between these 2 gentlemen sitting here. So let me add one question to the young philosopher, and repeating a question that was in other form raised yesterday. Why is it that philosophers have such a hard time accepting observable facts? I'm coming from the humanities myself, so I know I have asked this question 100 times in the most different circumstances, and I have made the same observation many times, that actually it's very hard for people with fixed mental concepts to accept observable and even measurable facts, even more measurable facts, as Gerhard Roth reported yesterday. Have you an explanation?
Actually, it is even in science of or philosophy of perception or philosophy of knowledge, when you treat that subject, you realize that nothing is quite that clear. I mean, even perception isn't perfect, isn't kind of finite. It doesn't give you an image who lasts forever. Meaning, we have certain concepts even in philosophy of perception, which give us the impression that perception kann fehlgehen. Ich wechsle es auch Deutsch.
Can fail.
Can fail.
Can fail.
Yeah, and this kind is still a hard point to counter. I think when you realize that once perception can go fail, you have you have kind of the fundamentals who are a bit in movement, who aren't anymore that stable. And I think it's important to question always even the fundamentals. And what I face is moreover some kind of another fundamental change of fundamentals. And I think it's a kind of task of philosophy of humanities in general to go beyond beyond these fundamentals and to ask what are they good for and what are the implications and where are their limits.
Okay, I would like to accept that, but let me remind you that the glory of Western science consists of having the possibility to experiment under laboratory conditions, that you have fixed conditions and you have repeat certain experiments on one continent and on the other continent, and you got the same results. And I think concepts, mental concepts, can be changed at the spur of the moment. Mm-hmm. And so why is this so difficult?
Let me take his part for a moment.
Sure do.
I think doubting and criticizing concepts is simply the job of philosophers. So if they are doing the job, they cannot say this and that is measured and it is so. Then they would be true believers into science. That's fine, but that's not philosophy. So as philosophers, they have always to try to get something problems in the concepts. The same has been said to psychoanalysts. We are not a community very open to empirical research, as you know. And the danger is that we get into the trap of disjunction of paradigms, which we discussed shortly yesterday. Professor Roth's comment on Mr. Jenny's comment on Professor Meyer's speech. So this is a trap if we try to exclude one paradigm to the other. I think the solution is really about cooperation, but maintaining the paradigm of their own discipline. For example, if you are trying to make literary criticism, literary science on a natural science base, you can describe the Zauberberg by Thomas Mann as ink on paper. It is ink on paper, yes, but this is not very helpful for a literary criticist. He has to grasp the meaning. So, does this exclude to describe the Zauberberg as ink on paper? My opinion is it does not. Because ultimately, also the literary criticist has to refer on the material substrate of the novel. That means the psychoanalyst has to refer, in the last instance, to neuroscience, because it is the brain and nothing else. Maybe it is the brain and it is the surrounding, the structures and the information stored in the surrounding, in the society, in the monuments, and so on. Now, these are hard facts we have to refer to, ultimately. But in processing, in posing our questions, in making our theories, in making ourselves fit for the dialogue with the other sciences, we have to maintain our stream of thought and our intentional argumentation. Otherwise, we it wouldn't be a dialogue anymore.
Thank you. May I close this, on this conciliatory note, may I close this dialogue and have just a few minutes added for questions to the substance of your main presentation. Yes, please. Okay, I'll come back to you. Microphone, please.
I was really amazed by your last issue about the rhythm, because probably as you know, in the recent years, brain imaging have been published looking at people who are listening to music. And compared to the language where the image is cortical and very localized, in the people listening to music, there are many subcortical structures in the brain which are reacting and are active. But the only, let's say, stringent correlation is the rhythm, is not the melody.
Yes.
And this is really very interesting, because this was also proposed as an explanation for the music therapy success with certain Parkinson patient and certain type of Alzheimer patient. And my question to you, do you know in this type of study with children, if there is, if the, let's say, the use of music and rhythmic in the kindergarten on a regular basis has an influence on the results you have presented?
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I don't know about this precisely, whether the use of music and rhythms in kindergarten influences results we are discussing here. But I think your contribution is very important. These new findings about the brain imaging of rhythm and music, it also has to do with language development. The same findings apply to the analyzing of syntactical structures by their rhythmic qualities. There was an article in Nature, I think last 2 years ago, about that.
Thank you. Next question, please.
My question is very practical, I think. I understood the value of the mother and baby relationship, and I understood as well the value of learning in a group, even being a very young child. So there is always a discussion, should the child remain in the family, or is it a good system to be in a group very early? I think of kibbutzim, I think of école maternelle, I think of Hort, and so on. Is it contrary, or are both options really good options?
Yes, an excellent question.
From your experiences. Thank you.
An excellent question, many thanks. And there is a great debate now on the external nursing, early nursing concepts. We had in the Psyche, our psychoanalytic journal, discussion about it. And I think it brings the point that you can judge this from on the behavioral level. You can say mothers are always better than nurses, something like that. That's not true. It depends on how they interact with. It's always, everything is on quality. So in many cases, it might be much better for a child to be in a good nursery, and there are criteria for nurses if they are good or not, so continuity and. In a good nursery, then to be at home with the mother is under stress and has no time and so on. So I think we always have to discuss about quality, which these discussions are always a bit more complicated than to judge from the first view of the external facts. Is that the answer you wanted to hear?
Thank you. We could expand on that, I'm sure. It's a hot political issue as well, of course.
Who decides? The question is, who decides in our society? This is the difficulty, I think.
Yes.
And who gets the Maßstäbe?
Yes. In our democratic society, public discourse decides ultimately, and public discourse is influenced by research. So we have to do research on that.
Thank you. Last question, Mr. Kuknov.
I think it's very interesting that the point you make that temporality is important in the development or prevention of violence. But I'm not sure whether I have understood your point rightly. What is the role of time in the prevention of violence? Is it that you you wanted to tell us that it is the allowance for rhythmical processes to happen, to be allowed to develop themselves naturally? Or is it proto-narrative envelopments? Is it a time which we have to use for, say, narratives, for thinking, for talking? So is it the problem of not having enough time to share in society, and would that be probably a marker for some sort of present-day diagnosis? I thought if your talk was very interesting. Yeah. I've been living in Switzerland for 15 years, and I'm German. And of course, being German, I would never say that the amount of violence has increased. Looking back at the German history of the 20th century, I would say the opposite, of course. But maybe it's not important to say it has become less or more, but to try to find out what the special issues that lead to a proneness to violence are today, and maybe it's speaking very roughly, the less amount of time allotted and allowed for social processes.
Yes. Thank you for this very clarifying and enlarging question. That's not rhetorics, I really think so, because I do not think that we should now dance with our patients. It's not what I don't object music therapy, but it's not what I do. I was thinking about the music of therapy. I was thinking about what you are alluding with narratives. So the narrative, proto-narrative envelopes trained into the early childhood and retrained in adolescent enculturation processes, this plays in every moment, in every narrative. So I can shortly quote an interesting study done in Basel by Dr. von Klitzing. He could prove that parents who live themselves in narrative structures, who tell stories to each other, who can fantasize their coming child and they tell stories to the child, produce children with a higher and better attachment qualities. So narrative, this space and room for narratives is very healing and is very important, because if you can narratize your experience, you can internally manage it, and then you don't have to hit your enemy, but you can think of a strategy or something to do something over the edge to get him or to get your self-stabilization and so on. So narratization is one of the most important medium in developed societies to avoid direct violence. And I think this is the point. Thank you that you cleared this. This is the point I'm going to. The intensity, the narrative structure, and the temporality of the contact is the important point.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to have to conclude this discussion here already, but we are running late again, of course, but we would like to go on with the next presentation, and I would like to thank Professor Hamburger and Mr. Heim for their thoughtful presence, actually.